welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice, and my guest today is Michael Benedict. He's the editor of a book called In the Face of Disaster. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
What kind of disasters are we talking about here?
All kinds. Land, air, sea, all sorts of disasters in Canadian history.
So all related to Canada?
Right.
Maybe you should explain the source of these stories that are included in this volume.
Delighted. At Maclean's, we've been around now since 1905, so it's almost a century that we've been part of the Canadian fabric, and as a result, we've been very much part of Canadian history. And while we've been a news magazine for only 25 years, we've certainly been a magazine of current affairs and issues ever since the very beginning. And one of my, I won't even call it my jobs or duties, but it's my great pleasure to have a kind of responsibility for our archives. And started out a number of years ago when I was preparing a special edition for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, that I found this treasure trove in our archives, all kinds of great material. And to make a long story short, that led to the first book that we did a few years ago called Canada at War, which was based on archival material. And because we've been around for so long, there were articles from the First World War right up to the latest Gulf War. And then subsequently, again, through mining the archives, we did a book called Canada on Ice, 50 Years of Great Hockey Writing, and then Canada in the 50s, and now we have In the Face of Disaster, because all this great stuff is there.
You have many writers, many voices, I guess, and the tragedy of periodicals is that they get tossed after a while. So now you bring this stuff back for readers in the book. There's a lot of death and destruction here, but of course there's a certain kind of focus on heroism. Did you truly find that the worst brings out the best in us?
Well, I mean, fortunately, yes. You know, there was, I was just looking again at the piece about the Halifax explosion, in which the writer points out after this horrible devastation. Maybe we can talk about that in more detail later. But there wasn't any looting that went on at all during at that time, and then there's countless examples of heroism there as people, and in that particular case, they came from all over North America to help out, and if they hadn't, it suggested that there would have been many more deaths because of the medical supplies and people that immediately responded from the United States as well as across Canada. And pretty well in every case, you find examples of people just sort of, I mean, almost instinctively dropping what they're doing to go to help their fellow man.
So is this what the stories reveal something about the nature of human nature?
And I don't think that's a particularly Canadian thing. I think that's a universal. But it makes the stories that much more human when you focus on this human element, on the people. I mean, you can count up property that's destroyed and people that have died, and that's very relevant and it's dramatic. But then it's these anecdotes and stories of people that how they responded and what they did to help the survivors. That's what I think you're left with at the end of the day in reading the tales.
And a lot of that is forgotten. I mean, many of the events that you speak of here are things that we're not real familiar with. Let's start somewhat close to home here, where we're filming today. Moose River in Nova Scotia, April 1936. What happened there? I'd
never heard of that particular disaster, and so I was fascinated to read it. And in fact, that's Moose River, Nova Scotia, and it was a coal mining disaster, of which sadly Nova Scotia has a long history of, going all the way up to Westray, which is another piece that's in the book. Interestingly enough, there's nothing on either of the Spring Hill disasters. But getting back to Moose River, what's interesting about that is not the deaths, because only one person died there. Only 3 were trapped. I mean, one person is significant, but there have been coal mining disasters in Nova Scotia where dozens have died, as you well know.
But it drew the attention of North Americans.
That's what this was a huge media story. Even in Britain, the broadcasts were to the BBC, and it kind of was the first one of these disasters. People talk about I think the making of CNN, when that little child was down a well in Texas a number of years ago, and there was this constant reporting about locating the child and getting the child up, and it went on for a day or so.
But these were radio reporters, were they?
Well, and at Moose River was radio and newspaper.
Yeah.
I mean, then newspapers had more than one edition, and there was a couple of two of the three people were from Toronto who were trapped down there, and the Toronto had two major papers plus others, and they were constantly running editions based on very little information. What happened there at Moose River is that they had one telephone line out, and they actually had fisticuffs among the journalists, and the provincial minister had to step in and allocate the time so that each reporter got, I think, 5 minutes an hour. And the CBC, and this was a kind of the making of the CBC in terms of being a news source for across the nation, they had 3 minutes every half hour. And there were no phone calls coming in, so the reporters hadn't, because the line was tied up just going out, and the reporters there had no idea of the kind of impact that they were making. And the CBC hookup went to the BBC in England and throughout the United States, and so the whole country, the whole continent and parts of the rest of the world were riveted on this event.
From a fairly remote place.
That's right. And so they had no idea how big this story was becoming, who were there, and then the rest of the world was kind of united and following this disaster.
And it becomes part of people's everyday lives, doesn't it, as we follow these things. Let's go to another part of the country, the Red River out in Manitoba. Every once in a while rises and rises. In 1950, there was a flood, and again in 1997. Of course, there's probably been many more along the way, but maybe you could compare those two events.
Well, and there were the Red River has a history of flooding which goes back for hundreds of years. One of the common themes in many of our Canadian disasters is the role of the military, who come in and help out and they were prevalent in both of those floods. And the 1950 flood led to the construction of a spillway, I think is what the term was, that would preserve or protect Winnipeg, which was what the main concern was. And in fact, in all the subsequent floods, that spillway worked, except the 1997 flood, which started in North Dakota, and you could watch the flood. I mean, and everybody did on television and in newspapers and magazines as it moved up from North Dakota and was threatening Winnipeg. And then they figured out very quickly that this spillway wasn't going to work, and that they had to build what was called the Brunkild Dike, which was old school buses and wrecks and things like that they just put sandbags in between, and that pretty much saved the city. The 1950 Winnipeg did flood, but luckily the loss of life was minimal, although the property damage was quite great. But it shows, one of the interesting things that I found going through these archives, if I may, is especially, well, we're in the 21st century now, and it's more true now, but in the 20th century, latter half, people weren't much concerned about Mother Nature. It was felt that was under control, which isn't, a recent phenomenon. In centuries ago, that's mainly what people were concerned about, was controlling nature. Now, except for people that live on the coasts and we don't experience tornadoes the way they do in the United States, pretty well we forget about it, so that when you get something like that, you know, the impact is that much more dramatic, and it's a good reminder that we shouldn't be so cocky.
Sure, that's right. I mean, we're shocked and appalled if there's an ice storm in Montreal. How could such a thing happen? As if somehow our civilization is too great and we're past all that.
Yeah.
You do include man-made disasters. I was interested in how Canadians reacted to the stock market crash in 1929. I mean, it was certainly, my head was full of images of New York and the United States, but how did Canadians react?
Well, in the same way, and if you read that piece today, it's eerie, some of the similarities. I mean, there are major differences in terms of protections that are supposedly there in the market, but the idea of that everybody was involved in the market, everybody was talking about the market, that share prices were their multiples over earnings were astronomical, as they are in.
Sounds like today.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, this sounds just like some of the columns that I'm reading today.
But investors jumping out of buildings and that sort of thing.
Well, there were that I didn't find much evidence of in Canada, but certainly the desperation was here as well, and the impact. Then subsequently the depression and the relation of the crash to that was here too. But nobody jumping off Mount Royal, Montreal being the main financial center at the time that I came across.
Another man-made disaster, you were talking about the Halifax explosion originally and the fact that there was no looting after that. However, in 1945, in Halifax, there was major looting, and it was the Canadian military virtually at war against the city. What happened then?
Well, that's a piece that arguably doesn't fit in terms of disasters, but it's a part of our history that we don't know very much about, and perhaps that riot pales with recent hockey-related riots. But you know, here it was the end of the war, the day the war ended, and a time for celebration and joy. And what happened in Halifax, and obviously there were some forces at play that had been building up. There was a 2-day, one-night riot where the property damage was extensive, and most of it instigated by the troops that were in Halifax, and shop windows broken. A brewery was laid siege to. The reason for all of that is that in their wisdom, the public leaders in Halifax decided that whenever the war ended that day, there would be no liquor sold, because they didn't want people to go crazy. Well, it just produced the opposite result. And in fact, there was thousands, I forget what the number is, of sailors and military people here, maybe as much as 20,000. But it was a huge number that were living in the city, and there had been friction between the forces and the citizens, and lots of frustrations building up between the two of them. And the military people were allowed booze, and then it was cut off, and then they went into the streets looking for more. And the restaurants were closed, and the shops were closed, and the liquor stores were all closed, and one thing led to another, and we had 2 days of rioting. Not a pretty scene.
No, it wasn't. I've seen those pictures. Does good come from disasters? Not so much maybe the Halifax riots there, but do we end up with safer ships, safer trains, and people better prepared for weather calamities?
One hopes so, but almost certainly in each of the major disasters was followed, including the Halifax riot, almost within days with official inquiries, which had recommendations. Certainly in the plane and rail disasters, I mean, that's just a matter of course, and ship disasters, I mean, I should say all of them. It's a matter of course to have an inquiry and then certain recommendations, which I think by and large have all been implemented, but then there's something else that comes up, because it's not that cause for the crash wasn't because of that, it was because of something else that that comes along. Yeah. But at least it's a better situation than what it was before.
We're going to take a short break right now, and we'll be back with my guest, Michael Benedict, right after this. Hi, welcome back to Off the Page. My guest is Michael Benedict. One of the most haunting disasters in your book was this Newfoundland seal hunters disaster in 1914. Maybe you could describe that. Tell us how that happened.
Those First World War I years were pretty bad years for disasters. In that case, it was, talk about there was heroism and tragedy. There it must have been just absolutely horrific. A bunch of sealers were let off a ship onto the ice floes, as they were routinely, except this time there was a miscommunication among, I think, 3 ships as to who would be responsible for picking them up.
They'd be let off out on these ice pans, and the ships would go away and then presumably come back.
That's right. Yeah, and that's the way the seal hunt went, and up till this point, never without this kind of confusion. And the one ship that was supposed to have been there to pick them up went off to do something else, and then a storm came. It was a beautiful day, and they actually took off their jackets as they got off the ship and got into the seals. And as Easterners know too well, storms can come very quickly and very dramatically. And a storm came, and then they were just stuck there, not one night, but 2 nights. And the cold came, and there's stories of some of the people trying to keep others alive by singing hymns, by walking around, whatever. And half of them, some 70 odd, died. And when they finally, the weather cleared, and they finally found a ship, and when the rescue ship, or the ship that rescued these men, found them, they had no idea these men were missing. Nobody did, because everybody still, there was no radio contact, and that was one of the things, speaking of inquiries, that was established afterwards, that it would be mandatory for these ships to have radios. Well, they didn't have them. One had a radio, but it wasn't working. So that nobody knew these sailors had been missing. All the captains thought that they were on the other ship, because they kind of went in a team. Yeah. There's one story of a guy lying, and another sealer goes up and wants to take his jacket. I
remember that. He says, "I'm not dead yet."
Yeah. So he waited a few minutes, and then he was, and then took the jacket.
There's certainly plenty of sea disasters related to Canada. There were Canadians on the Titanic.
Yes, and if you think you've read everything about the Titanic, you haven't. And we're lucky to have 2 pieces that go in tandem on the Titanic. One of them focuses on a Canadian honeymooning couple from Calgary, Mr. and Mrs. Dick. He was quite a wealthy land dealer, and he and his wife did the grand tour of Europe, and then came back on the maiden voyage, and both survived. One might ask how he survived, because there weren't very many men that did survive the Titanic. And what happened is, first she refused to go on a lifeboat that was being loaded, and then an hour or so later, another one was being loaded, and she did agree to go, and said farewell to her husband. And the officer who was loading that particular lifeboat looked around, saw that there was still space there, shouted out for more women or children, couldn't find any, and then shoved Mr. Dick into the lifeboat, and that's how he survived, and he felt guilty about it for the rest of his life. And then we have a companion piece there from the second officer on the Carpathia.
So it was one of the rescue ships attempting rescue.
The main rescue ship. It wasn't the closest ship, but it had its signal. It had its wireless man was at the station. There was the ship that was much closer, but they had no idea the disaster was going on, because they'd closed down the wire for the night. And they rushed there. Took them 4.5 hours or so, recklessly through icebergs as well, and came and picked up that was the ship that picked up all the survivors, took them to New York City, and that fellow who was the second officer, Sir James Bissett, later went on to be captain of the Queen Mary during the Second World War, when it was a major troop ship, and was one of the bleeding officers in the Cunard line.
Of course, here's this prime example of the professionals being not prepared for the unexpected to happen. On the other coast, there was a tragedy of the Princess Sofia. That's certainly one that we're not nearly as familiar with. Maybe you could just briefly describe that.
And it's the worst sea disaster on the West Coast. I mean, 343 people died there. That's a considerable number of people, and I guess because it was again I think it was 1918 that happened. Maybe
6 years after the Titanic.
Yes, and because the war was on, there wasn't perhaps, or just after the end of the war. I'm not sure my dates now. That in any event, there wasn't as much attention paid to it as there might have otherwise been. But that one was a weird one.
It was a coastal steamer going up and down the
going from Alaska, mostly with Canadians, down the coast of British Columbia, and ran into and got trapped in a storm in the rocks. And what was weird about it is that it radioed its position, it was in trouble, and nobody really thought that this was anything terribly serious. They were just going to wait for the storm to end, and then the tide would go up, and then they would free themselves and then go merrily along the way. And we have pictures of the ship, because it wasn't that far offshore, of the ship trapped in the rocks. And a sister boat went up and said, should we take the passengers off? It was stormy, and they felt that would be too risky to take the passengers off, that they would be better off just waiting aboard the vessel. And then I think about 5:30 in the morning, I think it was, all of a sudden the ship broke up, and not a survivor. A dog was found 2 days later covered in oil, still alive. That was the only living thing that survived that vessel, and hardly a piece of the vessel survived.
That was the Princess Sofia out there in BC. Michael, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back again right after this. My guest today has been Michael Benedict, and we've been talking about his book, In the Face of Disaster. Is there anything that you want your readers to take away from this book? I mean, should people go out being safer or keeping their eyes out for natural disasters, or what?
Well, I think we should be reminded not to have too much hubris. We shouldn't be so cocky that some of these disasters happen to professionals who are experts in their field, and something goes wrong, or Mother Nature just turns on you and can do it very suddenly. And so one should be careful and be prepared at all times. It made me feel, oh my goodness, I should watch it almost, not every time you go out the door, but just don't be aware that there are other forces out there.
You never know. Now, despite the tally of disasters in the book, is it possible that Canada is actually a relatively safer country than others?
Well, I think weather-wise we are. We complain about our weather, but we don't have typhoons, and we don't have hurricanes, and we don't have tornadoes, and we're relatively earthquake-free. So, for all those reasons, I think we're pretty safe. But we do have 2 oceans, or 3. And we should watch them all the time.
Better keep an eye on them. Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.